right, aloha everyone. It's about 3 p.m., so I'm going to get started even if we're missing a few people. My name is Amy Durham, and I would like to welcome everyone to the Tropical Conservation Biology and Environmental Science Graduate Program Natural Resource Management Seminar Series. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Elliott Parsons, the Natural Resource Manager of Pu'uwa'awa'a State Forest Reserve in North Kona for the State of Hawaii Division of Forestry and Wildlife. And he is also an excellent adjunct faculty member here at UH Hilo. So Elliott first fell in love with nature while obtaining his undergraduate degree in ecological anthropology at UC Santa Cruz in California. It is here he spent time exploring and tracking wildlife through the surrounding meadows and forest. Following this passion after graduation, he extended his coursework to gain additional background in ecology and evolution. This helped him get into the wildlife biology graduate program at the University of Montana at Missoula. While at UM, he conducted fieldwork along the Mogollon Rim of the Coconino Forest in Arizona for his PhD dissertation, which focused on how large herbivores influence ecosystem structure and function. After obtaining his PhD, Elliott taught tropical ecology in Costa Rica for Mesa Community College before he accepted a position in Hawaii with the Watershed Partnership Three Mountain Alliance working in Pu'uwa'awa'a. He now currently serves there as a biologist and natural resource manager for forestry and wildlife, focusing his attention on the protection and restoration of habitat for our native plant and animal species. So today he is here to speak with us about Pu'uwa'awa'a management as seen through the RAD framework. And with that, please help me in joining Dr. Elliott Parsons.
Mahalo, Amy. Mahalo, Lisa. Mahalo to all of the TCBES students and participating community members for welcoming me here and giving me the opportunity to spend the last few days racking my brain for something fun and hopefully somewhat intelligent to share with you guys today. The papers I sent out got a lot of great questions from you guys. Mahalo nui for that. And I'm going to try to tie together, if I can, the RAD framework, Pu'uwa'awa'a, the gardenification of nature, indigenous rights, and the Anthropocene, if that is possible. Let's see if we can do it. I'm going to share my screen. All right, mahalo again for coming. And this is a view looking at Pu'uwa'awa'a, where I've spent most of the last 11 or 12 years working in North Kona on Hawaii Island. So I want to start with the bad news, and then we'll get to the good news later on. I mean, we all know at this point that the climate is changing and changing fairly rapidly before our eyes. And there are a few news stories just in the last few months. And so I wanted to focus on ones just in 2022 because there were so many that stood out to me. The first one, February 14th, droughts are getting longer and more intense. This was study finds Western mega drought is the worst in 1,200 years. And you can see the water lines on Lake Powell decreasing. And the water levels dropped by more than 150 feet. Here's another one that came out. This was a little bit later, February 23rd. Wildfire is likely to increase by 1/3 by 2050, warns the United Nations. This is a picture of wildfires in California. And then you guys probably saw this one on the paper as well. This is a picture of a house on the north shore of Oahu that collapsed onto the beach, which has been eroding due to powerful winter spells. And then this is probably the most shocking to me, and I actually saw this in the West Hawaii Today newspaper just 2 days ago. Eastern Antarctica registers temperatures 70 degrees above normal as, quote, unprecedented heat wave baffles scientists. And here is a small quote from the article. the extreme weather was also registered in the Arctic, where temperatures were more than 50 degrees warmer than average. Walt Meyer called the situation on both poles pretty stunning. They are opposite seasons. You don't see the North and the South poles both melting at the same time. So how are things changing, and what does that mean for conservation and management in Hawaii and the Pacific? As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, we have this great product, the National Climate Assessment, and this is the fourth one. Chapter 27 was about Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands, written by a lot of great folks in Hawaii and the Pacific. And it was released in late November 2018. And the chapter detailed climate change indicators and impacts. And just a plug for the fifth climate assessment, which is going to be out pretty soon in 2023. And there were a lot of great figures in this assessment. Check it out if you haven't gotten a chance to online. But indicators, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with how things are changing, sea levels rising, surface air temperature rising, more intense storms, extreme events, changing rainfall, sea surface temperatures increasing, habitats shifting in distribution, ocean chemistry changing. All of these things are happening and happening before our eyes. And one of the things that I want to focus on with you guys over the next few minutes is that current management and conservation practices still largely assume the long-term stability of ecological systems, and this is problematic. As an example, the word restoration appears in the most recently approved Hawaii State Forest Action Plan of 2016 59 different times. Climate adaptation only appears about 11 times. But restoration as a tool implies returning a population, community, or ecosystem to a previous pre-disturbance state. And so what does successful restoration require? So this is from a paper, Anticipatory Practices, Shauna Hirsch. And I thought it laid out a good recommendation for how to do successful restoration. So comparisons using undisturbed sites as reference baselines, for example, have been fundamental to experimental design and ecological science since the early 1900s. Measuring success or failure in ecological restoration not only requires setting historical baselines for populations, but also establishing reference habitat sites, analog ecological systems that act as controls for comparison or a restoration goal. However, there's good reason to believe that with directional climate changes, restoration to previous states may not be possible. Here's an example from the fourth assessment. Corals, if warming trends continue as they are, corals will be bleaching annually throughout the entire Pacific Islands region by 2045. And that's not too far into the future from where we are now. As well, you can think about increases in annual average temperature over time. This is another chart from the climate assessment. In the future, it may be too hot and dry in many locations for native tree seedlings to persist, especially in dry forests. And temperatures have already gone up a little over 3/4 of a degree Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. And so it's important to consider we may not be able to regenerate forests given the changing climates, at least forests as they have been structured in the past. And then this one, I'm sure everyone knows about the story with our native forest birds, that as temperatures increase, mosquitoes that carry avian malaria and avian pox move upslope, and native forest bird habitat vanishes. Articles indicate that both the islands of Kauai and Maui may have no longer suitable habitat for some of their native forest birds in the very near future, and extinction for some species may occur just in the next few years. Here is another indicator that things are changing rapidly and we need to pay attention. This is a recent policy article on water management calling for the abandonment of the assumption of stationarity. And the big picture, and by water management, the system we've created in order to distribute drinking water to people and agriculture and different human needs. The big picture is that we are moving outside the envelope of natural variability. We can no longer depend on the past as a guide to the future with respect to water management in this space. We talked about restoration and some issues with restoration going forward, and I want to talk about resilience as well, and how the concept of resilience in ecological systems may be equally problematic as restoration, at least in the climate adaptation context. Resilience has come to mean the ability of ecosystems to recover from some kind of impact. From the IPCC 2007 report, quote, ability of a social or ecological system to absorb disturbances while retaining the same basic structure and ways of function. I wanted to grab some kind of Google image to represent resilience, and all I seemed to find were pictures of usually males trying to push large objects against the forces of gravity. I'm not quite sure what that means, but maybe something is going on there. Okay, so resilience. We have this nifty idea of alternative stable states and tipping points, and it is appealing in terms of thinking about resilience. And so, if you look at that picture from this paper, in the lower right, we see a stable state 1, which is a coral reef, kelp forest with macroalgae. And there's some kind of disturbance threshold, which if you get over that disturbance threshold, you're over that hill to the right, and you're pushed into some kind of new alternative stable state. In this case, maybe there is some macroalgae, but you have barren ground and turf. And so you've shifted your ecosystem. And you can think about this in terms of that threshold. I'll call it R. And R is going to be our resilience threshold. So the question for resilience and ecosystem structure is, how do we increase the resilience of ecosystems so it is harder to tip them into an alternative state? Because most likely we're using that concept of resilience because we want things to stay the same or as near the same as possible. But it's complicated because how do you quantify R? That's the big question. You could do small scale experiments, but we know that ecosystems are very complex. And without having to disturb that ecosystem more and more until it changes, how would you ever know until the changes are upon you? How would you quantify, for example, the impacts of your management actions on an increase or decrease in R when you don't know where that threshold lies? And I love this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes from a few years ago to explain the conundrum with alternative stable states. And so Calvin asks, how do they know the load limit on bridges, Dad? Dad says, they drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge until it breaks. And then when they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. Oh, I should have guessed. And so if you take this joke and you just replace the load limit with resilience and bridges with ecosystems, then you'll get my point that it is difficult to know how things are going to change until they change. You can't manipulate entire ecosystems. These tipping points are being triggered more and more, But given the complexity of ecological systems, will we be able to predict them? And I want to point out one scary, really scary moment from last summer in the Pacific Northwest, in case you missed it. And then I'm going to share my screen and share just a couple minutes of one of the videos. And you guys probably remember the heat dome that affected the Pacific Northwest in 2021. There was an article written about it in the New Yorker magazine, 72 hours under the heat dome, where it was incredibly hot. And they've got a great subtitle, A Chronicle of a Slow Motion Climate Disaster that became one of Oregon's deadliest calamities. This heat wave started in June 28th. It lasted about 4 days with triple-digit heat, 113 degrees Fahrenheit on June 28th with a nighttime low of 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And this was about 25 to 50 degrees hotter than average. Temperatures peaked in British Columbia at 121 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is actually hotter than the all-time heat record in Las Vegas set in 2021 as well at 117 degrees. So what is going on? This is pretty crazy stuff. Well, some of the impacts that maybe didn't receive as much attention as they should have were how many sea creatures were affected, and in particular, the intertidal zone. There were massive losses, estimates of more than 1 billion sea creatures killed, and I think this is probably a gross underestimate. There is a group doing fantastic work called the Pacific Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And they had a 2021 virtual symposium where they had a short presentation on this. And I just want to share that really quick with you guys. I'll just watch 2 minutes of it. And then after we're all horribly depressed, then I'm going to try to turn things around and cheer us up. How about that? Does that sound like a deal? Okay, somebody, since I can't see everybody, somebody tell me if you can't hear it. I'll assume that you can.
The species that really suffered a lot were the ones that are attached directly to the rock and don't move. So seaweeds, mussels, and barnacles. And those barnacles on the right, those are 2 species that can survive exposure for several hours, temperatures up to about 45 in one case and about 48 in the other. So they're really thermally tolerant, and they still died. My student Lara happened to be doing a project on rockweed at a particular site, and this is a photo she took a few weeks before the heat wave. This is a few weeks after at the same site, and the damage is still in the tissue of these remaining individuals. So about a month after the heat wave, that shoreline was almost completely denuded. So really big impacts on the seaweeds. Really big impacts on the mussels. They are probably the best sentinel for this. Having a black shell is probably no good on a hot sunny day. The photo on the left, it just shows dead and gaping mussels. The one on the right is someone, just a member of the general public sent it to me, that shows snow drifts of blue mussel shells washed up on Galiano Island. So really unusual and extensive mortality. And to give you sort of a more visceral sense of what these shorelines were like during the heat wave, here's a video of me walking along a shore in Galiano, and hopefully you can hear the crunch. That's not a normal sound you get when you walk in these habitats. When the mussels are alive and closed, they'll support your weight, but when they're just dead and empty shells, they don't. And you can see that just goes on and on. And in this particular spot, it's an area about the size of a tennis court, and with some random quadrat sampling, we estimated that 1 million mussels died just in that tiny area. So the total scope of the mortality is staggering. But there are some interesting patterns in there.
All right, so that was a short video showing whole intertidal zones being wiped out, which is just pretty shocking. Try to get that. Okay, so moving along after that really disturbing section, and you can, maybe I'll do this right now, see if I still have it. I'll do this after. So for anyone who wants a copy of this presentation and all the papers that I read that led me to create this presentation, I'm going to put a link in the chat at the end. It's all in a Google Drive. So some folks have questioned resilience and whether this concept might be maladaptive in terms of climate change adaptation. The critique of resilience, me and others from this paper, it's hard to measure R, that threshold, or your management actions effect on R, because you'd have to measure so many things in the community. We would need an army of people doing that, many more than we have today. The concept is ambiguous. It's often misunderstood. It's difficult to apply consistently across disciplines and spatial and temporal scales to support conservation efforts. However, its use is increasing in the literature over words which might be more appropriate, such as resistance, transformation, or facilitation. It also has different meanings across stakeholder groups. And then I think this quote from the paper is really important. Rapid directional change, punctuated by amplified extremes, compels candid disclosure of the likelihood of ecosystem shifts beyond historical ranges of variability. And it makes me wonder if by using resilience, we're giving people a false hope that things might stay as they are, not change dramatically. The author's concluding remarks was, quote, "Is this catch-all label useful, or is it a maladaptive term that confuses and impedes progress in climate change?" And then here's my biggest problem with resilience as a conceptual tool in climate adaptation. From this other paper, Moorcroft, here is a list, table one of a bunch of things that have been proposed to increase resilience to climate change: control invasive species, protect natural processes, reduce other pressures on biodiversity. And as a land manager the last 10 years, my reaction to this is almost all of those recommendations to promote resilience are things managers should be doing already, even without climate change. So I'm not sure how helpful those things are to basically tell managers, you need to do what you're doing, but you need to do it 10 times as much with the same or even less funding. So are managers then moving away from this idea of resilience and towards something different? This was an awesome report that came out recently from the Pacific Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, and there are different networks around the country. That video I showed was from the Pacific Northwest one. And this report was spearheaded by Laura Brewington with Pacific RISA and others, and it surveyed natural resource managers across the Pacific about climate change and invasive species. Among many other things, managers were asked to, quote, rate potential climate-related research topics as priorities for management actions. And here is one of the graphs from that showing priority in climate research topics. And resilience of Native communities was the second highest ranked one, and nearly 100% of natural resource managers thought that this was a high to medium priority for research. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm all in favor of us finding ways of being resilient. But what I wonder is if maybe there are other things we can be doing to prepare for and deal with the current and oncoming changes. So how do we move beyond equilibrium models of management? And can we move beyond things like resilience and restoration? Is there a better framework? So a group of scientists from the National Park Service, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service came together and over a couple-year period were able to produce this report, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, framework for the 21st century natural resource management. And it was partly motivated by rapid changes observed in some areas that raised questions about how to manage the resulting novel ecosystems that replaced, previous intact forest areas. And one of the most striking examples, and I have to thank the authors who created a special section of bioscience in 2022, as well as sharing this in a number of online presentations that are available in YouTube. The Alaska Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, 40,000 acres changed over a 3-decade period from a spruce forest to a grassland. And managers were struggling with what to do. And part of this was, a large part, was due to the impacts of increasing temperatures and spruce bark beetles spreading north and having big detrimental impacts to the forests. So you end up with these grasslands, a totally different ecosystem type than you had before. And so managers are wondering, what do we do now? This is from one of the articles in this bioscience special section, which I highly recommend. The papers were given out freely, and they're also in Google Drive that I'll share with you. And I love this image of the accept, resist, and direct. And you can imagine resisting, you're trying to resist change, you're going against the wind and against the waves. You're accepting, maybe you're going with the wind and waves. Or direct, you're going to be catching the wind, putting up your sails, catching the wind, and letting it take you to, hopefully, some new desired location. And this is a screen share from Gregor Schnurman, giving one of those awesome presentations about this concept. And the resist, you can think about it as working to maintain or restore ecosystem processes. Accept, allow things to change without necessarily altering the trajectory. And then direct, try to actively shape the ecosystem process towards some kind of preferred new conditions. And this is the paper that you guys read, one of them. And so just to reiterate that, we'll move on. From that reading, quote, managers navigating ecosystem transformation can benefit from considering broader objectives beyond a traditional focus on resisting ecosystem change, but by also considering whether accepting inevitable change or directing it along some desirable pathway is more feasible. And so I think that brings up one of the points that a lot of management has been in that resisting state. So can we apply some of these ideas or principles to management work in Hawaii? And so I want to use Pu'uwa'awa'a as an example. Pu'uwa'awa'a, Ahupua'a, is a place that I love dearly. I've been there a little over 11 years, 11 and a half years. And a few things about it. So one, the namesake of the Ahupua'a is the Pu'uwa'awa'a cone here in the picture. These are crown lands. There has been over 100 years of private leased cattle ranching. In 2003, a management plan was created. And in 2007, a forest reserve was established. DOFA, or Forestry and Wildlife, has been involved since the early 2000s when the first coordinator was hired. I was hired as the second coordinator in August of 2010 with Three Mountain Alliance and Forestry and Wildlife in 2013. And this is just to show you where we're at. This actually, the white outline includes both the Ahupua'a of Pu'uwa'awa'a and Pu'uwa'awa'a, at least the Nauka regions that are managed by Forestry and Wildlife. And this shows you there's different land designations. There's a state game management area, forest reserve, and then FBS stands for the Forest Bird Sanctuary, which is a state wildlife sanctuary. It has Highway 190, the Mamalahoa Highway running through the middle. And then you see the Queen Ka'ahumanu Highway, Makai towards Kiholu Bay. It is an incredible place with incredible lowland dry forest and mixed music forest. This is looking from the east towards Pu'uwa'awa'a. It has, this is looking at Pu'uwa'awa'a from up Mauka in the Kaleo area. This particular area has some of the highest densities of cave and lava tube ecosystems in the United States in terms of opening and passageway per unit area. There's an incredible botanical diversity, and one of the earliest botanists, Joseph Rock, called this area one of the most botanically rich in all of the Hawaiian Islands due to the incredible endemic diversity of both trees and plants in understory and midstory. Forestry and Wildlife accomplished an incredible amount of rare plant surveys in partnership with Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit over the years since 2004. These are just showing some of the surveys done by the early habitat conservation crews. I believe this is slightly out of date, and there might be one or two more, but we have at least 18 endangered plant taxa there of all different kinds of species. So very highly endangered endemic flora of this region. And we can't fail to mention our largest native endemic insect, the okai, the black-fern sphinx moth, which is endangered and is also seen feeding on the native host, the endangered iea. So a question I want to ask, given all of the changes, the directional changes that we talked about in the first part of this, how do we protect this unique biological diversity? I think that's the underlying question. So with the RAD strategy, RAD framework, RAD resistance is our first go-to. And it's particularly important for tropical lowland dry forests, of which there's less than 5%, and probably at this point, less than 1% remaining. So preventing wildfire is one of our biggest resistance strategies. We all know from last summer that wildfires can be pretty big and pretty dangerous. This is a picture. You guys are probably all familiar with this sign. Please prevent fires along the Belt Road that burned during the large Waikoloa fire, which was one of the, if not the largest wildfire in recorded state history, 40,000 acres, or nearly 1.6% of Hawaii Island burned. This shows that we've seen a lot of fires in Pu'uwa'awa'a and Pu'uwa'awa'a, in particular, Pu'uwa'awa'a and Makai of Highway 190. And this just shows between 1975 to 2011. I think the red, if you went back 100 years, if we had those records, would probably cover a lot more. As part of our resistance strategies, we maintain about 230 miles of fire fuel breaks across 104,000 acres. It's a pretty monumental feat. I think we maintain more roads and fuel breaks than all the other state forest reserves put together in Hawaii, just at Pu'uwa'awa'a. The upper right hand corner shows a couple thousand acres that were burned. I believe it was in 2016, Makai the Highway, and that was a willy tree that was burned during that fire. I also want to note as well that we use targeted cattle grazing as a tool, as well as targeted domestic goat and sheep grazing to reduce fire fuel loads in order to resist the devastating impacts of wildfire on the native lowland dry forest, many of which these plants are not adapted to fire. We can also resist the impacts of non-native and invasive species. And so this is just an example of our current and planned ungulate exposures across this area. And we're planning to fence about 10% of the area, to remove those impacts of hoofed mammals. Another really good example of resistance is the early detection rapid response program for the state of Hawaii. So this is a National Park Service image showing the invasion curve and showing you where resistance is not futile. Basically, at the very beginning of the prevention is where you can start to resist these changes. And if you wait a long time, then it gets more and more costly to try to remove those non-native species that are having negative impacts. But unfortunately, resisting with exposures means accepting impacts outside of the fenced units. And so accepting is an unfortunate result of not having an unlimited budget and unlimited staff and time to be able to do all the things we would like to do, such as try to prevent goats, for example, from bark stripping some of the native plants. And an important question this raises is then how do you prioritize management? You resist here, you accept there because it's not as high of a priority. And I want to thank all of the members of this research team. These slides are from a U Hero presentation we gave for the NREM seminar a few years ago after this paper came out, but Christopher Wada led the effort. And what we looked at in Pu'uwa'awa'a was restoration and the effects of climate change on groundwater recharge and landscape flammability. And this is a picture showing current and future climate. And so it's a little tricky to understand, but you can see the green areas are our proposed fenced units. And the colors actually represent the change in the probability of fire occurrence. And so the more bright yellow you get, the less the chances of a fire. Whereas the darker you get, no change. So we wanted to know how would restoration impact this? And how would that vary across the landscape? And a couple of things that I just wanted to point out are that certain areas, Makai, of the Mamalahoa Highway, are going to become too hot and dry to restore. That was one of the outcomes of the study. And one of the management recommendations was to focus our restoration efforts on the areas Malka, areas upper elevation. But another thing that's important too is that the fire danger is going to be shifting upslope. And so it's going to have to change our resistance strategies and how we do management in climate change. And I can't remember which of the climate change scenarios this was, but I believe it was the RCP 8.5 for the future. So we've looked at a couple examples. We've resisted some disturbances. We've accepted others. But what I really wanted to talk about is direct, the D part of RAD. And the first thing that I have to admit is that I'm not really a fan of the word direct as part of the RAD framework. The first thing is I think it conveys that we have more power than we think we do to influence the course of future events or future environmental trajectories. Second, I think that it lacks some humility and implies a top-down or director style approach when maybe a bottom-up or a reciprocal relationship approach may be a better, healthier option. A couple of questions you might want to consider is what is the land telling you that it needs? And then are you listening to that? And the third is that I think it implies that we know what we're doing, which we don't often know what we're doing, unfortunately. And I think that's why management is ultimately an experiment and why adaptive management is always the best approach. Think about management as an experiment in terms of what you're doing, learn as you go, refine your approach. When things don't work, try new things. So one question I have for you guys at the end, and we're on the home stretch here, what do you all think would be an appropriate word to replace direct? In Hawaii, maybe one that seeks more of a transformation approach. I'm going to use the word nudge from here on out, because I like it a little bit better. It still has some issues, but I will call it the RAD framework from here on out. We'll just go from there. And I just want to mention a couple things about our work over the years at Pu'uwa'awa'a. I want to believe, and I hope that we have sought to nudge areas such as those dominated by non-native fountain grass into systems that have both native and culturally important plants. That we've worked with a diversity of partners and groups, organizations, passionate and talented individuals, the Ma'alama Aina. That we've trained students of all ages in plant identification and planting and stewardship techniques, and encourage connections to place through mo'olelo. And this work, I believe, has led to some amazing transformations over time. And I just want to share a quick before and after, and I actually don't even have the most up-to-date photo from this area, but this is before in the fountain grass in the Hawaii. So this is our 50-acre fenced unit. You can see the reservoir just to the left for those of you who've been here. And this is a education group. I believe this was Uluvini down in Kailua Kona. And this is that same area only 3 years later, full of an incredible diversity of native, indigenous, and Polynesian introductions. So to finish us off here, what are the challenges and opportunities of the RAD paradigm? And importantly, who gets to decide if and how ecosystems should be nudged? And who are we restoring or nudging those ecosystems for? And finally, you're probably wondering about my title about the Anthropocene. How do we embrace the Anthropocene? And I kind of say it jokingly, or not. I guess we'll see at the end of the talk. But Anthropocene, for you, those of you not familiar with, was the word that was come up with to describe a new geological epoch in which humans are of the most, or if not the most dominant forces on Earth. And so I guess I bring it up a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but we'll see. How do we embrace the Anthropocene if this is where they're at? And I think part of the answer to that question lies in the gardenification of nature. And so this is one of those other papers I had you guys read. According to Dan Jansen, who's a very well-known tropical biologist and worked down in Central America for decades. According to Dan Jansen, for coexistence with wild nature, we need to create a refuge for biodiversity by incorporating it into a wildland garden in which humans are an integral part. And as a side note, Dan Jansen was writing about biocultural restoration in the 90s. One of the papers you can check out on the drive is How to Grow Wildland, the Gardenification of Nature, which has some really good stories about his work down in Costa Rica. And one of the thoughts I wanted to pull from this is, quote, so how do we hide 235,000 wild species in the garden? By recognizing and relabeling wildland nature as a garden per se, having nearly all the traits that we have long bestowed on a garden: care, planning, investment, zoning, insurance, fine-tuning, research, and the premeditated harvest. Stop labeling the wild as the wild. There are simply many varieties of gardens. There is no footprint-free world. Every block of the world's wildlands is already severely impacted. And lest you think that Dan Jansen produced these ideas, I want to make the point that indigenous communities have been tending the wildland garden that is planet Earth. for a long time, with many positive impacts on biodiversity. And in fact, research over the last few decades is just starting to catch up to the fact that humans have had a profound impact on their environment, including places that Western scientists originally described as being pristine wilderness areas. And conservation has largely ignored the possibility of long co-evolutionary histories and relationships with people in place. And so there's some gems for you guys to check out. The more you look for, the more you find. The paper below provides examples from the Amazon, Southeast Asia, and Australia, where biodiversity may significantly rely on the perpetuation of cultural practices in those areas. People have shaped nature for thousands of years. And there is a call to restore the lost ecological functions that people provide to the environment. Recent articles describe the positive impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem processes of returning lands to native tribes, for example. The RAD framework, and I think rightly so, seeks closer engagement with indigenous communities and practitioners and calls to an end to the false dichotomy of humans and nature. And this is a great quote. The old paradigm of North America as a pristine wilderness was a dehumanizing one that missed the many and varied interactions of indigenous societies with their environments and ecosystems over millennia. So, where do we go from here? And I just have a couple more slides to finish this off. The American conservation movement has spent the last 200 plus years assuming that people are the problem, that people and nature are separate and that nature needs to be protected from people. And you can see this in our current system of parks, reserves, wilderness areas where humans are not allowed to reside. You can see it in our language or euphemisms for protected areas and reserves. You can see it on our laws, rules, and guidelines that either prohibit or curtail community caretaking, access, use of resources, or use of once indigenous lands. And you can see it across the globe where indigenous and local communities have been removed from their ancestral lands with the arrival of the North American model of conservation. I'm going to try to pull myself together. So how do we solve the existential crises facing humanity and the environment? How do we embrace the present and take the step towards a better future? And I think the first step is to change the way we view ourselves and each other. In 1968, Garrett Harding wrote The Tragedy of the Commons, where he articulated his belief that humans inevitably destroy their environments without draconian intervention from the government. But the tragedy of the commons is a false and dangerous myth, as is articulated in this. I believe Garrett Hardin mistook humanity as a whole for the impacts of unfettered global capitalism. I think he was wrong. Humans have deep capacity for sharing resources, improving their environment, and loving each other and working to benefit nature. And I know firsthand because I've seen it at Pu'uwa'awa'a. All the